You'll remember from what we've already discussed that the economic engine of early Virginia was tobacco. That was what was making this colony rich. You'll also remember that tobacco required a lot of workers. That's another way of saying it was labor intensive. They needed lots of people to grow and process tobacco. Now, this presentation is the story of where they got those workers. In the 17th century, the 1600s, the main source of those workers was indentured servants who came mainly from England, and they worked for a term of years and then got their freedom, if they lived long enough to get their freedom. In the 18th century, the 1700s, the source of labor shifted. It Virginia came mainly to rely on African slaves for their labor in tobacco. Now, whenever we have a major change like this, remember the job description of historians. It's to explain change. Well, we have a lot of explaining to do. Why this shift from indentured servitude to African slavery? Now, let's begin this story with a lot of unhappiness on the part of former indentured servants. Uh, Land prices were going up, and a lot of them didn't have enough freedom dues to be able to buy a very good quality or quantity of land. So there was only poorer land left, and they mostly were not doing very well after working very hard under horrible conditions for a number of years. So they're pretty angry. Uh, the land that they did get bordered on land occupied by Native Americans, and therefore these former indentured servants were subject to attacks by Native Americans. Uh, so this is not a very satisfied group of people. And the tensions boil over and come to a head in 1676. It's easy to remember that date because it's exactly 100 years before the Declaration of Independence. They came to a head in something called Bacon's Rebellion. Uh, After 1650, the living conditions in Virginia were better, so more servants lived long enough to be set free to finish their terms of indentured servitude. Um, and most of the rebels who were part of Bacon's rebellion were former indentured servants. Now, and they had weapons, which were necessary to protect themselves against Indian attacks. Uh, and this was a group of people who hated both the planters, the wealthy landowners, and the Native Americans. They hated them both. Now, the leader of Bacon's rebellion was actually a planter, an upper class person by the name of Nathaniel Bacon. But the majority of those who fought with him were these former indentured servants. What they did was attack native peoples, but they also turned their anger at Jamestown, the capital, the center of a lot of the wealth and power in Virginia, and they burned it to the ground. And this was very significant. They had some alliances with Africans. There weren't a lot of Africans in Virginia at the time, but there were some. And there were examples of these white former indentured servants working together with Africans who were slaves, or in some cases, indentured servants themselves. Now, the result of this is that the planters, the wealthy landowners, were terrified. They were terrified because they had the prospect facing them of the majority of their population, poor workers, regardless of the color of their skin, uh, teaming up against them. Now, that raised a question about how Virginia society was going to be organized. Was it going to be by economic class? Was it going to be indentured servants and Africans together against planters. If that had been the case, then the planters would have been in a minority. They would have been outnumbered. Or was it going to be organized by race? And that meant whites versus blacks. In that case, the planters would have been in a majority. Now, which of these two did they prefer? Well, it's not hard to figure that out. They wanted Virginia society to be organized along lines of race. So they actively promoted racism. This is not a pretty story. They promoted racism because then they could be in the majority. And this same psychology of wealthy whites saying to poor whites, you are one of us. We need to stick together because we're white. That same psychology was used over and over and over again in the history of the South. It was used in the Civil War to convince poor white Southerners to fight for the South, basically to fight to protect the interests of these wealthy planters. It was used during the 20th century to promote the Jim Crow system, the active and aggressive separation of people on the basis of race. And this pattern that has shown up so often in the history of the South began in part because of Bacon's Rebellion. Now, what did the planters want? What would be their ideal solution, if you can call it that, to this situation? Well, they wanted, first of all, they needed workers, and they didn't want to pay them very much, so they needed poor workers. But what kind of a workforce would be ideal? They wanted a labor force that would be reliable, that did not have weapons, because look what happened in Bacon's Rebellion. They wanted a group of workers that would never own land. They wanted these workers never to be free. Because remember, those indentured servants, when they got their freedom, caused all sorts of problems for the planters. They wanted workers whose descendants would also work for their descendants, for the planters' descendants, so that their work would go on not only for their lifetime, but for the lifetimes of their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and as far as the eye could see. And not only that, if they could get workers who could be easily identified, let's say by the color of their skin, this would be absolutely ideal. So the perfect solution for these wealthy Virginians was African slaves. Now, this set of changes in Virginia was taking place over a period of years. It wasn't only the consequence of Bacon's Rebellion, although Bacon's Rebellion was a major milestone in this series of changes. If we look at the changing laws of Virginia, that will give us a window into what was going on. First of all, laws are passed for a reason. They're passed because those passing them, the legislatures, want to correct what they see as a problem. So laws are not passed by accident. Now look at the laws. In the 1640s, sex was banned between blacks and whites, which again emphasized the idea of Virginia society being separated along lines of race. In the 1660s, slaves were branded like cattle on their arm or forehead so they could easily be identified. Also in the 1660s, masters were protected by law if they, quote, had to kill a slave. Now, you might say, why would they have to kill a slave? Well, the mentality was that since slaves were property, then if any master killed a slave, they only did it because they had to, because they would never voluntarily destroy their own property. Now, this, of course, completely overlooks the crimes of passion that masters were often guilty of. It overlooks the way that they used violence to keep control over their workforce. But the law just chose to ignore these factors. In 1671, blacks could not be baptized. So they were that what they're doing there is laying the groundwork for an expansion of slavery, so that they did not have to say that baptized Christians were being enslaved, because that violated a tradition in English law. Now later on they simply changed the law, but this was part of this increased separation between the races. And in the 1680s, all black persons were considered slaves unless they could prove that they were free. If they didn't have the papers to prove it, then they were simply automatically treated as slaves. So there is a major shift in the labor force from indentured servitude to slavery in the late 17th century, and then especially in the 18th century. Now, why this change? Well, first of all, as we've already discussed, there was a fear of former indentured servants, and that fear came to fruition in Bacon's Rebellion. But there were other factors as well. In 1698, the Royal African Company broke up. Now, they had had a monopoly on slaves. Now, whenever somebody has a monopoly, the prices tend to go up. But now there was more competition. If you wanted to buy slaves, you could go to different sources to buy them. So the price of slaves declined. At the same time, the price of indentured servants was going up. Why was it going up? Well, because England's economy was doing better. Remember that to get an indentured servant across the ocean to Virginia, you had to convince that person to sign that contract and voluntarily come over. Well, they were less likely to sign that contract if they had better job prospects over in England. So to get them to come, you had to offer them better terms. You had to say, well, instead of working for 7 years, maybe you only have to work for 4 years. And that made indentured servants less of a good deal for these planters. Finally, life expectancy improved in Virginia. It was becoming a healthier place to live. Now think about this. If slaves were more expensive to bring from Africa than indentured servants from England, then the only way it would make sense to bring slaves over is if they would live a long time. If they were only going to live 3 or 4 years, like many people did in early Virginia, then you couldn't get your money back from the investment. But if a slave would live for many years, decades, and if those slaves would have children and grandchildren, so that those slaves would be able to serve your children and grandchildren, then slavery became a better deal. This is about economics. It's about profits. It's about planters who were incredibly obsessed with making vast riches from tobacco. And as we saw earlier in an earlier presentation, the tobacco business was absolutely booming during this whole period. Now, if these arguments are valid, then we should see in the population of Virginia dramatic increases in the total number of black persons. And we have some good sources of population data. We can check a series, a couple of books called Historical Statistics of the United States, which go back into the colonial period. Let's look at some numbers here. In 1670, the total number of people in Virginia altogether was around 35,000, and only 2,000 of them were black persons. So the majority of those 35,000 were indentured servants. Now remember the date of Bacon's Rebellion. It was 1676. So after that, we would expect the number of black persons to go up. Well, the total population of Virginia goes up, but it doesn't double. But the number of black persons in Virginia in 30 years increases eightfold. So that's some pretty dramatic evidence. But look at what happens after that. In 1750, the number of black persons, and almost all of them were slaves by that time, had grown to more than 100,000. And by the time of the American Revolution, it had grown to about 220,000. This represented about 40% of all the people of Virginia were slaves, African slaves. So we have a very dramatic change from indentured servitude to slavery. And if you're not clear on exactly why this happened, you might want to review this presentation and record any questions that you have to ask in class.